Hello. Hello. Ha! It works. Good morning, or rather good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to our discussion on product science. We hope that you'll have some inspirations to take away from this, and we thank you for coming to listen to us and not listening to Elon Musk.
So, yes, thanks for coming. We wanted to give you a little sort of teaser on what's going to happen in this talk, aside from what you might have read in the description. Elizabeth and I spent a lot of time figuring out how to tell this story and how to tell this story in about 45 minutes. So we landed on a journey that we're going to take you through. So we're going to travel to a space that is defined by the forces that shape our product reality. We'll try to learn how to orient ourselves in this landscape. We're going to then discuss different product edges and boundaries and mountains in this landscape. And then we'll see how delight and frustration come from the steepest edges. Then we'll realize that sometimes you don't always need to change the landscape. You can change perception of the landscape in order to get delight and solve problems.
So, with that in mind, we're just going to give you a bit of background, a little bit of background to how we think about science and why we think about science, and then we'll go in and dig deep. So, I'm Elizabeth Churchill, and I started out life as an experimental psychologist. So I've always been fascinated by humans and fascinated by experimentation and the scientific method for trying to deeply understand principles that underlie human behavior and to test assumptions around those principles. I then went on to work in artificial intelligence for a while, and then my PhD is in cognitive science. So really trying to understand people, model people, think about people and how they work. And my PhD was looking at how those theories could actually be coded into programmable user models, which is where we come to human-computer interaction and interactive product design. So always thinking about how the science informs the practice, informs the models, and then how you test whether your models are the right models or not.
And hi, I'm Nadav Aharony. It's kind of scary to think about it, but I've spent about 20 years now doing product and engineering and research kind of roles, both in academia and PhD, but also in the military and larger corporations like Google, but also I've started and advised and been part of different startups. And I think the common thread for me has been around how do you productize early stage technology, and how do you productize something that is disruptive and might not be ready for prime time yet, but you still want to create compelling experiences that you can launch today and not wait 5 years until the technology is fully baked and ready.
So, I want to talk to you about the Wallace Wheel of Science. So I don't know how many of you are scientists. Can you? Yay, quite a lot of you, great. So this is the Wallace Wheel of Science, and Walter Wallace was a sociologist who passed away a couple of years ago. And why I love this model is that when people think of science, they often think of science in terms of this deductive, the right-hand side. That you start from a theory, you make a deduction, you generate hypotheses, you measure, you get observations. And in lots of ways, when we think about product design, that's the sort of launch and iterate cycle right there. Right? That's the deductive launch and iterate cycle. Now, the other half is the inductive part, which often gets left out. It's often the hidden, invisible work of thinking about how you're going to test, how you're going to think about your new product area. That inductive side is where you start to summarize what you already know. You generalize what you already know, and then you make these creative leaps. And that's where these new products are so interesting, because those creative leaps are where you're imagining a new product space. You haven't got anything to launch and iterate. You haven't yet got users. You haven't got activity logs. You're not refining a mature product and iterating on features and testing them. You're imagining a whole new landscape of what is possible. And so where experimentation sits very nicely on the right-hand side, on the other side are methods like brainstorming, methods like ethnography, which is a practice of understanding people's behavior in the real world, understanding the why, understanding the how they do things now, as well as what they do. So the ethnographic, the going and really understanding people and their motivations as they play out in everyday space, is where that creative landscape can be imagined and explored. And then we go into things like brainstorming. Then we go into things like, design sprints to imagine a new space. But the wheel of science is to always do the deductive and the inductive. The imaginary space, the new space, and then the launch and iterate and test. So we need to think about that whole wheel and not have some part of that creative to experimentation process be invisible rather than another. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Some of you in the room might remember the 1970s, where a personal musical device was a thing that you held like this. It became popular in the 80s as a sort of joke reference backwards. But what was interesting about the Sony Walkman was a real creative leap in this space. This idea that you would have your own soundtrack to your life was a really creative leap. And interestingly, that creative leap was a big risk, and it was a successful product for Sony. But they did do launch and iterate. After they imagined this new space, they did do interviews and observations with people listening to music. They did think about the fact that you would want music on the go, and that not everybody wanted to carry a 15-pound boombox. They did engage with people in everyday life. And then they launched the first Sony Walkman, which had 2 headphone jacks, because as per this lovely couple here, they believed that one person would carry the music and they would share the music together. The launch and iterate of that, including interviewing people about how they were really using that soundtrack in their lives, was to find out that actually most people just wanted to lock themselves off and listen to their own music. So the next set of iterations of the Walkman had 1 headphone jack. So there you have the creative leap, the ethnographic, the market potential, all of that really open kind of exploration that then led to the launch and iterate and test, including interviewing and looking at and observing behavior. A couple of other great examples I'm going to do quickly. These are about also delighting people. Nadav is going to really talk a lot about how you get those big changes of delight where people kind of go, oh, right, I hadn't thought of that, but that transforms my life. That's the first e-reader. When e-readers were first coming out, we were trying to think about what people would use them for. And I went off and did a lot of interviews and observed how people used physical books and so forth. And here's a little bit of a surprise that I had. We were trying to understand, people would use these for productivity. Everybody always talks about recipes, right? The recipe, the kitchen, everybody talks about that. One of the nicest things we found out by going out and observing people and interviewing people with mock-ups and prototypes and so forth, I did not work on this specifically, but I worked on very similar products, was when I interviewed women, a lot of women said they really wanted to have these e-readers. The reason being the emotional labor of dealing with being teased in the family because of their magazines and their romantic books. They could now read their romance and comedies, and they could read their magazines without their teenage kids teasing them, because he didn't know what mum was reading. Now, what was interesting about that for me was this was a whole practice, which makes sense. Remember that hindsight is not foresight. We always say, well, that's obvious once we know it. The ethnographic and the observation is to kind of go, oh, I'm challenging my assumptions. I did not know that. That is interesting. And that was one whole market and one whole area of reading practice that it had never occurred to me until I went in and observed other people. Science is also about challenging your assumptions through data. So to step back, oh, I didn't give you my other example. That's the Chromebook. What's lovely about the Chromebook is that it breaks, many products have done this, but this is one of my favorite examples right now. It breaks that idea that you unbox a computer and then you set it up, because it comes all set up with all your stuff. And you open it, and I don't know about you, but I opened it and I was like, and now it begins, the downloads, the setup. But it doesn't begin like that here. You just open up and you are you on this device. And that is again something that Nadav is going to take you through, that moment of delight as a user, where you suddenly like, oh wow, I didn't expect that. So, principles of scientific inquiry. Always link research to relevant theory and prior work. Very often when we're imagining new products, we're like, well, I am in my armchair and I am imagining things that I think are great. They are things that are great for me. And very often, a lot of the marketing around what your product is going to do comes a little later, after you've already started to flesh out that idea. I'd say science always says go back to see what else is in the area. Pose very clear questions that can be investigated and aim for principles like human emotional, motivational principles. Think about the what you're going to give somebody and why it matters psychologically for them in the practice of their lives. Really critically interrogate, what are we trying to do for people to reduce cognitive effort, to increase reasoning, to increase connection to another person? What are the psychological motivations and the practical exigencies of everyday life that will allow that product to be part of their life? Replicate and generalize across studies. Take a longer view. Look from all sides. Nadav is going to show you how we think about that in the product concept space. Don't just do a couple of ethnographic studies or a couple of experiments with a few mock-ups. Do a bunch of them. And provide a coherent and explicit chain of reasoning and rationale for every single investigation you do. What are you trying to find out? Very often when I'm working and we're evaluating product ideas, you find that the actual rationale for why people are doing things shifts as they talk about stuff. They don't go back to their original notes and say, wait a minute, what we were really looking at here was A, B, and C. When you're doing science, you have to always be really clear and really record your rationale and your motivations. You have to be reflexive around your own practices. Prepare to be surprised. Look for the strength of the result. We're always thinking about, is this a significant and important, we talk about it obviously in science, all the scientists in the room know, as p-values, right? The probability value of something. But look for when you could be surprised, but also look for how big is this result really? Discuss the work to encourage scrutiny and critique. I know in design practice, the design crit is really important. In science, the experiment crit, the science crit, the design of the experiment crit is very important too. And you have to allow yourself to be humble to the data and to that critique and not take personal ownership of it. A lot of products end up coming to be because of a very personal passion, and people feel challenged personally if it doesn't work out. Falsifiability is a really important concept in science. And it's this idea that you will ask questions of your assumptions that will prove you wrong. You go out to prove yourself wrong. Humans have a natural tendency to confirmation bias, to look for things that will confirm what you already assume. Being practiced in science, you are taught. You have to practice doing tests to prove yourself wrong. And I think that's really critically important. And again, Nadav is going to help us think through some of that. So if you don't actually have data, you haven't launched, and you don't have users yet, some of these principles of reasoning within the context of a design sprint or a brainstorm session or over several months of multiple sprints might help you. Einstein was a big proponent of the thought experiment, and really what Nadav's going to give you is our thought experiments, or some of them. His favorite one of his favorite ones, was imagine that you have a twin, and your twin goes off in a rocket, and because of the special theory of relativity, your twin is going to age much slower than you. He tried this out to imagine, what does it really mean about space and time and how time speeds up or slows down? This was a beautiful thought experiment because it brought humanity into it too. Everybody in this room probably, I might be speaking to you, would just like to slow time down a little bit. So it's actually a very human example of a thought experiment as well. And Einstein's proposal was that if you stay on Earth, your twin goes away. By the time you're getting your pension, your twin comes back and is in puberty. So he used this as a story, as a thought experiment to appeal to others, but also to think about, his own theory. No talk on technology is complete without a cat. So the other most famous thought experiment is Schrödinger's cat. And this is about how a cat could be simultaneously alive and dead. And if you're a cat or a dog person, please check it out later. I won't go into much more detail here. But this idea of the thought experiment is really the scaffold for where Nadav is going to take you and the journey that we try to go on whenever we think about products and product spaces and use and the innovative new. So what this talk is about is some hopefully useful concepts that we use and why we use them, some ideas to drive exploration in early stage products in the absence of users and iterate and test and A/B tests. You could even imagine laying out what you would find if you did have users and an A/B test, right? So that in the future, when you've got something, you can go back and say, wow, this is what we expected. It is or is not confirmed, right? Some examples, Nadav has some beautiful examples for you. And what we want to leave you with is some thinking tools, just the way we use them. And this is provisional and it's open for discussion. And we'd love to hear your thinking tools in the same kind of vein as well in the future. So here we go. Link research to relevant theory, pose clear questions, explore related questions, think about the edges of where your thoughts are, where will your concepts not play out? What is this falsifiability here? Expect to be excited and disappointed, and discuss failure. And with that, I'm going to hand you over.
Hey, so let's start the journey with another way to think and to look about things. One of the things I love about science is, sometimes the real world, the XYZ dimensions are hard to analyze and hard to work with, and science projects, gives us different tools and mathematical tools to project it to a space where it's much easier to analyze and where you look at the underlying forces that cause the things we see in the real world. If we think about the product world, what is the physical world for products? It is the product details. It is the things that are on the surface of the product and the siloed domains of things. There's a best practice of how to onboard users in an enterprise product. There's a best practice of how to teach people how to use a healthcare app or how to design a healthcare app. There's a way to design an API in a right or wrong way, and similarly, how to kick off a conversational interface. But we want to take a step back for that. Specifically, actually, when you want to analyze products that are living and out there, that's where you have all the tools of launch and iterate, of A/B testing. You have users and you have data, and you can basically measure how users use your product and craft it and change it according to problems that you see and evaluating hypotheses. But when you work on highly innovative products that are mostly not out there or behaviors that are still not there, you can't use these tools. You don't have users, you don't have data. Even if you ask users how they might use a future product, you can't really rely on their answers because they're not going to be the true behaviors until they actually see and experience that product. The other challenge is sometimes you can't really launch and iterate. You sometimes have only one shot. You could be that you had a privacy incident. It could be that you had PR blunders. It could be that you run out of money before you can pivot and change. So the more work and more thinking you do before that first launch is going to help you reduce those risks. So if we think about the XYZ of the product world, this physical layer, we basically want to take 3 steps back and go into the U, V, and W space, sort of the space where the drivers and the emotions and the physical behaviors and psychology take part. So this is a space of usage, value, and work. And when we talk about value, it means all the utility and satisfaction and the benefits and the rewards your users get out of using your product. Work is essentially the cost and effort and the friction that they have to go through. And even behavior change, trying to get them to do something new, it's a type of work because it has a price. And usage itself is actually a spectrum because it's not about will I use it or not, it's will I use it every day, will I try it once, will I be so happy that I recommend about it to my friends. So if we go down to the base of it, there is this ratio, this trade-off where the more value you have, you're more likely to have usage, and the more work you have, it's going to hurt your usage. And so there's this trade-off and relationship between usage, value, and work. If we want to lay it out on sort of a space of axes, then if you have a product that has high value and low work, you'll get high usage right here. And if you have a high work and low value, you'll probably get low usage. And if it's not clear, this is where you want to be. A lot of value and very little work from your users. Now, really, when you think about this space, you can analyze where is my product there? Will my product be in a few years? Where are my competitors there? Where are my users? There's another way to look at this through a landscape, the work value landscape, where work is essentially the climbs and the terrain and how you move through it. And if it's flat, then it means you're not doing new work. Value are the rewards you get as you traverse through your product and through your experience. Work is essentially the path to value. But value is subjective. For some person, a certain experience will be a certain value, and for other people, it'll be a different value. I might climb a hill for $1,000, but I'm not going to climb it for $10. So usage is essentially the question of, will they traverse? Will they walk through your landscape? Will they, what path will they take, and how often will they take it? So now that we took 3 steps back and looked at the landscape, let's orient ourselves a little bit. So we said that usage is a spectrum, that function. It could be the toothbrush test, which is a question, will I use this product twice a day? And there's a threshold for me, right? If this is my sort of personal function, above a certain value I'll use it, below a certain value I won't use it. And in this example, this product is below my threshold because there's a lot of work and not enough value for me. I'm not going to use it every day. But I have another function, which is, will I try it once? I'm willing to do a little bit more work to see, before I see a lot of value. So this product actually crosses it, so I'll try it once, but I'm probably not going to use this one every day. Me and others have totally different functions. I have a friend, let's call her Elizabeth, who will basically not stand in line for over 15 minutes. No matter how much value you're going to give her beyond a certain amount of work, she's just not going to go there. So if we look at a real example, so all of you probably know Waze, the navigation app. If you think about analyzing the Waze and how they started, Waze is basically relying on crowdsourcing. And their whole map and navigation system, and it relies on people driving, collecting data, and once they have enough data on the roads in a certain area, they can turn on the navigation function to people. And that's how they were able to, in a crowdsourced way, open up and turn it on in different parts of the world where we didn't have Google Maps or Apple Maps because they weren't traversed enough. So if you think about the sort of usage value landscape for a navigation user, you want to do a little work. You want to type in the search, and you want to get the value, which is the result of navigation. So it's kind of little work and little value, but you'll use it. Now, if Waze tells you, you know what, I don't have the data yet. How about you drive around and collect data for me, and then you can start navigating? Most users are not going to use that, right? There's a whole, for the average user, it's not worth it. But there is a subset of users where you can actually gamify it. Like, they'll actually enjoy the game of driving around. And initially, Waze actually launched an experience which is like a Pac-Man, driving through unmarked roads, getting power-ups. Once they get the critical mass of roads, they basically switch the product to the real one that we see today and got the regular users to start using it. So if you look at the values, so once you choose your perspective on this landscape, you either have a known population and you want to sort of fine-tune your value and work principles, or if you have work and value constraints, you should change the perspective. Maybe you should refine your target population to a population where you actually are above the line. So usage function is subjective, and you want to choose your perspective. Now that we've chosen our perspective, let's see what it means to move in this space. So we looked at a snapshot of a still point in this space, but really it's about movement through this space, because your product changes, your users change, their environment changes, nothing is static. So your work and value of your product keeps changing over time. So let's look at an example of increasing the value of a product, which is a great thing. So Delicious, it's first and foremost a social discovery and social bookmarking app. When you think about the social value, you need the network effect. You need a lot of users to get that social value. In the beginning, in the first phases, you don't really have enough value because you have too few users. If you just log in and you look for recommendations from other people, you're not going to have that many. So you're going to be below the line for the social value. But the Delicious team basically started with a single user experience, a single player mode, where they emphasized this is your bookmarks. And suddenly you have a place online to save your bookmarks, which will work from any machine and not saved on your current browser. There are enough people that for them that was above the threshold to just use it for their selfish uses. And then over time, the network effect took over, and the value of the product sort of floated up significantly. Another example where you increase the work, sometimes unintentionally, which is not really a good thing, without increasing the value too much. So fitness trackers, there are lots of studies that show how a lot of users stop using them after a while. 30% of all fitness trackers stopped using them after 6 months, 50% stop using them after 18 months. If you look at it through this work value lens, you can start explaining it this way, right? The users are required to do more work. You gave them another device. They need to remember to wear it. They need to remember to charge another device in addition to their phone. They need to sync and deal with sync issues, and they might lose it because it's, again, another small device. On the value side, after a while, the novelty wears off, and not a lot of people actually go back and look at their data or don't find enough value in this data set. So essentially, over time, you see that you're adding more work, not enough value, and a lot of people drop off. If we look at another, this is a mobile fitness experience I was working on back in 2010. We basically had these same constraints there and considerations about adding a new device or not. We thought about what if we use the phone as your fitness tracker. Now I'm saying 2010 specifically because it was the early days of Android, the early days of smartphone adoption. So the phones were much weaker than they are today. They actually had bugs in the operating systems. The battery was not as good. So if you really tried to do activity tracking, then you'll kill the battery very fast if you wanted to do accurate step counting. Plus, you'll also have to really know how they are wearing the device. Either tell them, put it in your pocket or hold it in your hand. But some people just want to put it in their backpack. So we basically realized that one behavior change is hard enough, getting them to do more fitness. Adding more behavior changes, like carry a device this way, keep it that way, keep it charged, was too much. So we treated this as our constraints in our product design. We realized that our experience actually didn't need accurate step counting. We designed an experience that just has general high level of activity. And it didn't take a lot of battery to calculate this sort of low fidelity metric. And you could put the phone however you want. You could put it in your backpack, you can put it in your purse. You'll still get a higher score if you walk more than take the car, or if you climb the stairs more than you take the elevator. So essentially, if you look at it through this lens, if you compare it to fitness trackers, maybe we have a little less value because it's not as accurate a step count, but it doesn't matter because we're looking at your behavior change. So for them, we basically have less work, slightly less value, but significantly less work to do. If you're looking at a user who never had a fitness tracker, for them, without changing anything, they suddenly get a lot of value. They get the new features of fitness. So we talk about movement in the space, but how do you pick which movements to focus on? You can do so many things around the space. So one of the most interesting things I remember from undergrad when I studied image processing was the fact that most of the information in an image is at the edges of it. Our brains are wired to detect edges. A flat landscape is not interesting. A flat landscape with a big hole in it is very interesting, and you need to detect it fast before you fall in. So our whole brains are wired to look at these edges. What does it mean to have product edges? So product edges are basically the edge between before a user uses your product till after they use your product for the first time. It's the edge between the trying out phase and becoming a habit. It's the difference between your online experience when you have 4G LTE to the difference when you're offline, you're on a plane, or you go to a different country and suddenly your product really deteriorates because you didn't plan well for that offline experience. It could be just standard transitions in your product as users change their goals and they complete a task and move to another task. That's a type of boundary. And there are generally transitions in their lives. Somebody gets married, has a child, their usage of products changes, and you have to think about that as a product designer. So let's take one example of one of the most important boundaries, which is before and after the first use of our product. So in landscape architecture, there's this term called paths of desire, where you look at where people walk on the ground, and then you lay out the roads because these are the best paths that the people chose. But when you think about it, on highly innovative products, you actually want to move them from the path they think is right for them because they don't know about your new experience. So these paths of desire become paths of inertia. They want to keep doing what they did before, and you need enough value and less work to get them to try out your new experience. In this example, for some reason, all these people wanted to go to that green trash can in that corner. Now maybe there's an amazing new and big trash can on the side. How do you get them to shift their behavior without being annoyed that you're forcing them to do that? So I'll give an example from my current company, Globality. So one of the things we do at Globality is try to revolutionize business processes, where one of the big examples that we do is we take the process of trying to find service providers and have a contract. You want marketing or legal help. The traditional way to do it is through a request for proposal, an RFP, which is an archaic document. I don't know if you've ever been on the side that writes an RFP or needs to respond to an RFP, but it's 100 pages, usually templates. People hate to write it. People hate to read it. Lots of reviews, lots of work. And it's a process that can take weeks or even months to find a vendor for, if you want to launch something in the Olympics next year, like a marketing campaign, and it's $1 million project. So it takes a lot of time. So at Globality, we're saying, we're actually doing a conversational interface where throw away the RFP, start typing what you want, and there'll be an interactive dialogue conversation that will adjust to you. And in 30 minutes, we'll generate a project brief, which is a 5-pager. That's going to be way better than your template because it's fine-tuned to your needs. So if we analyze it, it's like a no-brainer, right? You had the RFP, you did a lot of work, and you got value. Now we're giving you this really quick AI dialogue that you can finish it in a few days, and more value because it's personalized to you and to your needs. And if you say that you have an IP lawsuit in Russia, we'll tell you that a new law is coming into play and what questions you should ask from the legal firms you might want to get, right? So less work, more value, no-brainer. In reality, we figured out the situation was different. When you're talking about $100,000 project or $1 million project, you're not just going to dump everything you did before and start this new product of a startup. So most people came to try us out with an RFP in hand. They've already spent the time to write the RFP, and then they got to the dialogue and they got asked duplicate questions because they felt like they're doing duplicate work. Why am I being asked this again? Even though they got more value in the end, they got really frustrated. And duplicate work is even worse than more work. So what we did is we actually inserted a fork into the beginning of the product where if you have existing material, please upload it. We take it in and we basically pre-populate all the relevant answers that are related to what you already had, but then we can still generate new questions to show you the value beyond what you had before. So now you either have less work and more value immediately, or you try us out, you did a similar amount of work, but you see more value, and next time that you come, you'll not even spend time on an RFP. You'll just use our system from the beginning. So that's kind of how you focus on these important edges and try to fine-tune them so you take people from the inertia that they're on. Now let's look at emotions and how the change is related to these edges and the steepest edges. So we're talking about these edges in your product, but how do we choose which edge to focus on? So we look at edges that have the biggest change. For example, the steepest boundary of work. How do you get from a lot of work to almost no work? So if you remember the days of trying to connect and project either a movie to a TV or come to a company, try to give a talk, connectors and cables and connectors and adapters to the adapter to the connector, and you realize you forgot something and you can't project or you have to run to the store, and then comes a lot of work, but you have to do it because you really want to project on the big screen. Then comes this tiny device, plug it in. Most users don't even need to own it. They just come to a place, open up an app. This thing shows up contextually. It only shows up if there's a Chromecast nearby. And suddenly, magic. And this feeling of magic is coming because of the big gap between what was expected to what was actually experienced. You prepared yourself for so much work and such ugliness. Suddenly, it's just so fluid. And that gap is really important. Magic, right? So delight comes from steep change. But it also goes the other way. So in my house, we actually bought an Xbox One and a Kinect, mostly so the kids can talk to the grandparents on the other side of the world. So again, we're prepared for a steep climb to get a call set up. Find the remote. You find the other remote. Then you call your grandparents, call my parents, hey, drop everything, turn on your PC, it's probably nighttime at their place. Then you need to corral the kids to be on this couch at the same time for more than a minute. Then you turn on the Xbox, and then, uh-oh. It's time to update. And if you skip this update, you will have no network connectivity. So you have to update. There's no choice. So you start to update. So after about 20 minutes, we stopped. Grandparents went to bed. We didn't have any call. This difference between expected versus experience was super frustrating. Microsoft, couldn't you give me an option, right? Why couldn't we do the call and then do an automatic update afterwards? Give me the choice, don't force me. They've created an anger and frustration that is still with me. So emotion is the slope of your landscape, the derivative if you think about the mathematical formula, and you really want to look for edges with the steepest change to focus on. And so emotion comes from change, and delight is essentially the surprise that comes when what was experienced significantly surpasses what was expected. So that's where the delight and emotion comes from. Sorry about that. Okay, so we've talked about emotions. We're getting to the last stop, which is about perception. So change and delight can be also achieved through perception. You don't always have to change the landscape. You can change the people's experience of the landscape. And I'll give you a few examples on that. So one of the projects I worked on at Google was Google Nearby, which is a platform for devices to detect one another in physical proximity, and then you can build experiences where people detect devices and people near them, connect and do experiences in the physical world. We had a lot of issues because we wanted to launch it on iOS and on Android and on PCs and devices. But one specific problem was related to Bluetooth. So today, most devices, most of your phones have what's called Bluetooth Low Energy, which is the latest version of Bluetooth, which scans very fast and detects what's around it very fast. But at the time, most phones had Bluetooth Classic, basically, the previous version of Bluetooth, where it takes about 30 to 60 seconds to completely scan what's around you. So the problem was, a user taps a button to see what's nearby, and then do they wait 30 to 60 seconds before the screen refreshes? So we could wait a few years till enough phones had the new version of Bluetooth. Or we could do something else. So what we ended up doing is a pre-scan. Basically, we identified flows where users are likely to press that button, and we did a scan before that. So by the time they press the button, it's already preloaded, and they feel the magical experience. Now, there's a risk to that, because if we scan too often and the users don't end up pressing the button, we wasted battery for nothing. So you really have to analyze and figure out what is the flow where it's a high probability that they'll get to this. Another example I really like is Instagram. Mike Krieger, one of the co-founders, talks about how when you upload a photo, it might take a lot of time to complete in the background, but 99% of the time it uploads correctly. So what they have is an optimistic UI. The moment you upload, it tells you it's complete. Then you can go on to do other things in the product. In the meanwhile, it keeps uploading in the background, and then for the 1% of time it fails, then you deal with it then. This is my favorite example. Google Cardboard. Have you ever thought about why Google Cardboard has no headband like most other, Oculus and other sort of VR kind of experiences? So Cardboard wanted to do a cheap entry experience to VR, and they wanted to run on every device. So they don't want to wait, again, 3 years so everybody has powerful phones that can process everything. They wanted to run on a range of devices. Now, when you try to have an experience that is VR and you move around, the phone has to refresh the view. And if you have a weak device, it actually creates jitter and jumps in the video. And when that happens, people get motion sickness, they can throw up, they get headaches. So that's a really bad experience on VR. So what they did, if you think about it, your head can move very fast when you tie something to it. But when you don't have the headband, you hold it with your hands and you move with the speed of your torso. By forcing that, you force the user to move slower and actually bypass those jitter problems of the head. So you actually add a limitation to your product, but it solves a much bigger limitation in your product. So the form informs the function. So it's not the product that always has to change. It's sometimes you yourself that changes over time. So, sorry about that again. Okay, so we're getting sort of to the end of the journey. What can we do as product designers when we see a big mountain for our users? So in the XYZ world, in the physical world, we can treat it as a given and build things on top of the landscape. We can build, a gondola to take the users up the mountain so it's easier for them. That's the way you manipulate the existing product. But you as product designers also have the power to change the landscape itself. You also have the power to change the perception of the landscape. Somebody might be climbing up the mountain and you'll be talking to them and have an interesting chat or great music, and they won't even realize that they climbed up until they get there. And so this is sort of, again, thinking about the power of product design, and power is in the edges. Really, it would encourage you to think about changing the landscape or doing the illusion to change the perception of the landscape rather than just going straight ahead, add tutorials and add different widgets on your products to improve them.
Okay, thanks so much. So I wanted to just go back through these, and then we're going to go back to science. And as Nadav said, we wanted this to be about a 45-minute talk so that we could leave plenty of time for questions and discussion and reflections and thought. So I just wanted to summarize before we invite you all to share your reflections with us. So take 3 steps back. Understand the landscape. Don't get completely myopically involved in the solution that you believe is the right solution for whatever the problem is as you construct it. Stand back. Look from multiple perspectives. Take multiple different viewpoints onto what it is you're trying to address and onto why the solutions that you're coming up with are the right ones. Look at the edges. Even before you've got something, think about how are you going to introduce this to someone's life? What will be their first experience? How different will it be? Will it excite them? how much work are you going to ask them to do to move into this new space? Are they going to have to move all of their files around, for example? Are they going to have to completely change their everyday work practices? Are they going to be excited for a little while and then kind of feel like, I'm going to go back to my old ways. I'm going to go back to the trash can across the grass. Think about the current practices and the inertia. And actually, one of the other things, which is why that cow path was so nice, is that it's not a single user. It's what the others around them are also doing. Think about the products that are now coming into the home and the smart home. It's not the single user. It's the whole dynamic of the operation of that home that you need to think about. So there are edges, and what are the edges for one person or multiple people? Think about the delight of what people will expect and then what they will experience. That magic moment from a guy who looks like he probably carried the boombox I mentioned at the beginning, that magic moment, how long will that last and how big is that experience? And is it a whole family experience? And think about the perception. How are you presenting? Everybody thinks about this in terms of the introduction, the marketing of a product. But even when you're starting to think about this new space or new product, how will you change people's perception and how will you make sure that what you can do in the back end, or as Nadav likes to say, the mullet, which is, what is it? It's all business in the front and party in the back.
You delight in the front and keep your problems in the back.
Yeah, keep your problems in the back and keep the party right there. So back to science. How do those relate again? Relevant theory, replicate and generalize. Try many different perspectives. Pose very clear questions that you record and that you have rationale for why you presented them, and put them somewhere so that you can come back and reflect later and see how changed you are through these experimentations, if you like. Look at related questions. Think about the edges and limits of your observations and generalizations. Expect to be excited and disappointed, right? And think about how big a change you're making, but how big is the observation you want to see before you know you've really brought value and reduced work? Think that through in a thought experiment kind of way and record that and discuss with others. Discuss your failures of the past. Discuss your failed thought experiments, or not really failure, but where you think there are going to be real problems. And I think this falsifiability thing is really important because, as I said, humans naturally want to confirm things, but actually go out to prove yourself wrong and record that. And so with that in mind, I want to leave you with, no matter how many thought experiments and how much ethnography, you can never fully predict what your users are going to do with your product. So don't get too complacent, even with all your thought experimentation. You can launch and iterate and test and think through. Can't always guess. And with that, we want to say thank you very much and invite questions. Thanks.